only have about a 2-hour talk. So I'm sure you'll be, which I'll read, I'm sure you'll be prepared for that. I want to thank everybody at the Hoover Library. This has been a delightful place to work for a long number of years, and I have spent a lot of time here working. And I have 2 tasks today, but I should thank Tim and Spencer and Matt and Lynn Smith particularly. Not because she's photographing today, but while I was doing the Hoover fishing book, I would repeatedly say, you know, I think there's something in this particular PPI that you ought to look at, and I'd send her an email, and lo and behold, she would find it for me, particularly in the last stages. But we'll talk about my book later. Part of my job is to talk about Gary Dean Best's book, which I've read the entire manuscript, and which will be published along with Glenn's book in the year 2014. And I think one of the interesting things about the series will be that probably the most different of all the books in the official biography will be the Best book. And one of the reasons why is Justice Donaghy, who's from Florida and a very good historian from this period, also had taken a look at the biography. And I think I have those comments that he made. Justice and I are friends too, so. And he said that he got it right. I said that he got it right when he compared to other presidential biographers that Best's name was more like Arthur Link to Woodrow Wilson. And that was brought up by one of the other speakers today. And what does he mean by that? And what he means by that is that Donaghy means that Best clearly thinks that Hoover's right on most of the important issues. He's not offering a defense. He's in league with the former president politically and philosophically. The book is a political biography. This will make an interesting contrast with the earlier volumes in the Hoover series. I'll give you a couple of examples. An example of this would be Best's statement that Hoover was more capable, contemptuous of the abilities of Roosevelt, his cabinet members, Truman, and assorted Republicans. This is a whopper of a statement. That's hard to swallow, and of course one that cannot be empirically proved. It as well might be more of an insight into Hoover's character, and even a defense mechanism in response to those who had so humiliated him at the polls and made him the goat for the Great Depression. One of my historical rules are that I would not speculate this way, but one of my rules are that if frogs had wings, they wouldn't bump their butt when they hopped. And therefore, I won't speculate on empirical issues I can't demonstrate. Although I might be led in that direction, I'll usually set that up and let the reader decide for themselves. Best agrees that Hoover was smeared, and especially by attacks by Charles Michelson, but fails to acknowledge, from my point of view, that politics is a blood sport. Michelson always said the table was all set and all we had to do was sit down and eat. No doubt that FDR ran against Hoover in 1936. This has already been brought up. 1936, 40, and 44. And Democrats were still running against Hoover in 2000 and 2004. And obviously John McCain as well. Dewey asked Hoover, but you know, there's some real problems within the Republican Party, as Hoover is the titular head, and the left wing of the Republican Party was always unhappy about what they referred to, and oftentimes Democrats would refer to, as Hoover as the pariah from Palo Alto. In 1944, at a Dewey reception in New York, Hoover was there with both of his sons. And the Dewey aides came and asked him to step out of the reception line with his sons so he wouldn't be photographed with Dewey. So even within the party, because of that, I guess the reputation and the smearing, there's kind of an albatross around his neck, which makes it difficult. I think so, too, sometimes, you know, Hoover always wanted vindication, and he always wanted to run again for office and assumed he would. I don't think there's any chance he could have had that nomination. Maybe the best shot was in 1940. And then in the spring of 1940, Wendell Willkie announced out of the nowhere and simply swept the nomination away. But I think Hoover became very much to be respected. But he assumed that he would, you know, that respect would translate into votes. I think after 1932, that's not likely ever to be the case. The respect will come back, but not the votes. I think Gary does a good job, maybe a little even more in the 1930s, which I call the wilderness years. Like Churchill, Hoover had almost no place to go politically because he was not a political animal. You could argue one of the reasons that he moved to the right and away from his earlier progressivism was his loathing of the New Deal, which continued to animate so much of his political rhetoric. But principle two was important, but the fact that Hoover's progressivism was old hat and dead in but a few western states, I think, is a factor as well. Best goes on to comment, Hoover with consummate skill saw all the pieces in an intricate chessboard that made up the American and world economics. Well, that in fact may be true, but the core, what needs to be explained then is why there was so much difficulty in him implementing that. Hoover's re-election, Glenn just commented on this, Hoover's re-election might have speeded up the recovery, is a fair conjecture. But it is a counterfactual and it's beyond knowing. Best is right that Hoover surely believed, but then goes on to claim that Hoover would have solved economic issues and resolved tensions at the World Economics Conference that would have greatly lessened the chances of a Second World War. Best is sure of what Hoover would have done. And from my point of view, I don't think you can be sure of what could have done, and of course it's just as possible that things could have been worse at the conference rather than better. So those are the kind of criticisms I would suggest in the book. I also had hoped that Gary would do more in terms of Hoover and his life outdoors. And of course I've always asked that, and it may be unfair of me to ask that of another historian since I wrote a book on Hoover and his life outdoors. And I would be willing to confess that. But one of the reasons I say that, if I switch the topic a little bit here, is that I was working in the 1939, 1940, 1941 period on Hoover relief. And like my colleagues, I had always been taught in graduate school, both at the University of Iowa and the University of Kansas, that the uptight image of Hoover with the collar, cold, inaccessible, difficult to get to know, and I kept running into documents from 31 to 41 that contradicted that greatly. I would run into things that when Hoover went fishing or when he was in small books that he was a raconteur, he loved to tell stories. I'd run into things that said that in London, after the turn of the century, the Hoovers had one of the best California wine collections in the entire country. So that, the anti-alcohol things were wrong too. I'd run into things that Hoover loved to drink a martini and a half every afternoon, never two. And he always liked to wash them down with macadamia nuts and rat cheese. Well, this didn't gel with everything that I'd ever been taught about Hoover. So I wrote a paper on Hoover fishing in the Cathedral of Nature. I know Quakers don't have cathedrals, but in some sense he does have, I think, a Cathedral of Nature. And I went to Oregon and gave that paper, and Mark Hatfield talked to me afterwards and said, I think you could make this into a book, Hal. And I said, will you write the introduction if I do? And he said, yeah, I'd be happy to do that, which eventually happened. And then I decided too, if I was going to put this kind of effort in a book, it took me 6 years to research it and write it. I said, I'm not going to write the book and then shop it around to university presses. I'm going to get an agent. So I did get an agent who, at that time, I'd been taught that if I did a 1 or 2 page proposal, that was the way to go. And my agent said, I want a 30-page proposal. So we laid the entire thing out, and I thought, Fritz Heinzen's my agent. I said, Fritz will never sell this book. Well, now, I haven't written it or researched it yet. So Fritz calls me back in 2 weeks and says, I just sold the book. Well, now I'm on the hook. No pun intended. So once the research started, was it a challenge? Hoover always was very careful about his private time, and he guarded it fiercely. On the one hand, he didn't want to combine the two together. He tries to manage his public persona against his private life and keep them separate. And this was a terrible problem for him, and he never resolved the conflict, I don't think, in any meaningful kind of way. But that meant even his official calendar here at the library, if he's going fishing, there's just a blank there. Then you'd have to figure out from other documents where he was and what he was doing. And so the collections here were fabulous, particularly Richard Norton Smith, when he did his biography, really pointed towards the oral history collections here. And they're fabulous, and on the private side of Hoover, they're very good. So I thought, you know, maybe we could deal with this difficulty by writing a biography from the inside out. While my book is a complete biography from when Hoover was born in 1874 until he died, and all the important things in his administration are mentioned, they're always from the inside point of view, not the outside point of view. In other words, I thought that fishing, his life outdoors, was not something that added color, but that something was central to his analysis and him as a human being. To do this then proved to be a great challenge and lots of fun, because there's some good things in the Hoover Institution and some wonderful things here. The clipping file too is another wonderful source here for that sort of thing. But I decided that the challenge would be, the detective story here would be to get out and go to other archives to see what I can find. So I made a calendar list of all the places I knew Hoover had ever fished, and then decided I would contact every county museum in America in which he ever fished, because, you know, particularly after in the post-presidential years, the New York Times does not care where the ex-president is going fishing, but, you know, Lane County, Oregon would. And I found a treasure trove and a gold mine of things in the county museums. So eventually, now I didn't always find something I could use, but I eventually went to every county and museum in America in which he'd ever fished, and the photographs were fabulous, published photographs, and all kinds of good things about people he'd associated with. I mean, I don't think anybody before had written about Rainbow Gibson and Toggery Bill and his fishing buddies in Oregon, and what he did in the fishing camps. And I didn't ever psychologize. I'm opposed to psychologizing as well. So I try to present everything I could find as honestly as possible within that particular setting, and then the reader, you, can judge whether or not it reveals particular aspects of Hoover's character or not. And I think when you pile it all up over a long number of years, you'll really get to know him more intimately and to see what some of the warts were. One of the things I want to do today, I know you've been here a long time, and you've put up with us for a long time, but I made a list that we can hopefully discuss about some of Hoover's character and what compromised his character. I think from my perspective, he's shy and insecure, and that's exacerbated by his being orphaned. And I think he overcame that being orphaned, but at the same time, I think it shapes his character to a high degree. I think Glenn's right too about him being shaped by Quaker values. He's not good as a public speaker, and I think the reason why is he's always a little uncomfortable in his own skin. I don't think he's very reflective. I think he dislikes politics, which is a liability for him when he's in the White House, because he really has no political base in either the Democratic or Republican Party. And conservative Republicans never trusted him because, my God, he was in the Wilson administration. You know, he was essentially a cabinet member, so there's some distrust there. But he also is a dedicated empiricist, I think. His decisions were scientific and rational and empirical. He had an objectivity which he arrived at. And subordinates could openly contribute to a decision, but once Hoover felt that decision to be the right one, he felt it was a truth. There was no logical reason to argue against his positions. He gave subordinates wide latitude to carry out the assignments, but he would not tolerate deviation from the agreed upon plan. You can see this in the relief operations and see it at various times before and after, during his presidency. In his various relief campaigns, however, Hoover was not above spin. and sometimes guilty of crying wolf too long and too loud when the facts did not bear him out. That's, I think, particularly true with the National Committee on Food for the Small Democracies in 1941 to about 1944. He certainly knew how to select and manipulate data to serve his own purposes. Hoover outwardly approved of egalitarianism, a bottom-up grassroots idea. But in many conferences that he organized, especially when Secretary of Commerce, he almost always knew ahead of time what conclusions he wanted the participants to reach. Hoover is a top-down management kind of guy. Hoover had the ability to command extreme loyalty from subordinates, and many served him throughout their lives in various capacities. He surrounded himself with bright people who would work extraordinarily hard. 12 hours a day or more was not unusual. During Polish relief and Finnish relief in 1940-41, no matter the volume of mail, the secretaries had to answer all of the incoming letters the day they came in. If that meant they stayed to 10, 11 at night. He also has extraordinarily interesting work habits. He's perfectly capable of getting up at 1 or 2 in the morning and calling everybody to come in, which they would because he's on a tear in terms of his writing. We commented about his writing. I think Glenn's right about his books and how powerful they are. Remember that his book on Woodrow Wilson became a bestseller. And I don't know how many of you have read it. Do we have, is it for sale here? So you can get it. It's a very good book on Wilson and his relationship with Wilson. I always think that he got along better with Democratic presidents than he did with Republican, except for Franklin Roosevelt. And there I think there's enmity. He had a weakness, was that he assumed, and I think this is a weakness, and I suffer from this same problem, and maybe Iowa disease. A weakness was that Hoover assumed that any solution to a problem was to redouble his effort. That if you couldn't find a solution, the solution always was to work twice as hard. Hoover advocated the middle way. While he was committed to limited government, he was also an activist who believed in using government to solve problems when necessary. He tried to build a halfway house between Adam Smith and Eugene Debs, one based on voluntarism. He wished to engineer solutions to social problems. He also mistakenly assumed that people would sacrifice immediate gain to long-term purpose. Now, what I'm going to do is, since you've been patient for a long, long time, I'm going to put all those on the table for discussion. It might start World War III. We'll see if it does. So please, you can ask me questions about my Hoover book, about his personal life, but let's go ahead with the discussion session. Gentlemen.